And thank all of you for coming too. It's nice to see there's so many Whistler fans. And I assure you there's nothing I enjoy more than talking about Whistler. Now there is a problem, two problems actually, in talking about Whistler. You have first of all to decide which Whistler you're talking about. Let me show you what I mean here. For example, this is probably the best known Whistler. That is in people's imaginations. This is Whistler the Bohemian, I suppose you would call him. Rebellious, sort of languidly defiant, if you will. Clearly devil may care. I don't know if you can see, he's holding a cigarette in his hand there. He's wearing striped socks. And he's in what his mother called his lounging position, which he was always trying to correct. You know, sit up, Jimmy, sit up, sit up. So that's one Whistler, okay? There's this Whistler as well. This is Whistler the gentleman. I like to think of him as the thoughtful Whistler. He still has the cigarette. He has a cigarette in almost every photograph you see of him. And there's a bit of eccentricity. You see the white forelock he has there. That's actually natural. There was a genetic quirk in his family. His sister had a similar white forelock. But you can see there's kind of a gleam in his eye. He's pondering. He's thinking of something clever and witty to say. But obviously a gentleman. All right? Now there's this Whistler. Okay? This is sort of a mean-spirited Whistler. And he could be mean-spirited. He could be vindictive when he wanted to be. Still has a cigarette. Okay? But rather than a gleam, there's kind of a glare in his eye. You can almost imagine beneath that mustache, there's almost a sneer, like a stage villain. And then there's that Whistler. Okay? This is the jolly Whistler. This is a portrait by one of his students, Mortimer Minpez, a young Australian. Another eccentricity, the monocle, although in fact that was necessary to correct his nearsightedness. But this is the sort of Whistler you can imagine as getting ready to tell a good story, a jovial fellow, the sort you'd like to go out and have a beer with. But this is the real Whistler. This is a self-portrait, first of all, done around 1872. But this is Whistler as he most liked to think of himself, as a great painter. A life devoted, as the title of this talk would suggest, to art, to making beautiful things. And this is an even better depiction of that. This is another portrait of him by one of his students, done in 1880. This is the Whistler who's almost consumed by art. He's always doubting himself. He's always looking to improve, to do something new, to do something different, to do something more adventurous. And for me, this is the real Whistler. It's not that those other Whistlers don't exist, and it's not that he's schizophrenic or has dual personalities, but Whistler was an actor. Okay? He liked to portray himself in different ways, depending on the audience, depending on the purpose. Okay? So all those other Whistlers are real, and you'll meet them along the way today. But for me, this is the person I wanted most to understand as an artist. In fact, this was that first photograph, the Bohemian, that turned out to be the dust jacket of the biography. This is what I wanted on the dust jacket. But my publisher said, no, that's boring. We want something lively. Okay? But this is the Whistler I want to talk about. Now, I said there were two problems. The other problem is the amount of work that Whistler created, his body of work, and the amount of work even that survives. There's some 2,700 pieces of art that Whistler, well, not that he created, that have survived, that we're aware of, that we know of. In every media, oil paintings, and oil paintings of all sizes, 7 foot high, full portraits to the little 5x9 oil that Sarah mentioned, watercolors, pastels, lithographs, dry points, etchings, charcoal drawings. I mean, you name it, and he did it. And he did it with flair. He did it with excellence. Okay? So in talking about Whistler, we need to focus on a particular work of art. In the limited amount of time we have, I think that's maybe the best way to understand him. And so today I've chosen to focus on this painting called a Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket. It was done in 1875. It's not a large painting. It's about 2 feet tall, about 1.5 feet wide. But when this was first seen in 1875, it amazed everyone. I mean, this is a landmark in Western art. Nobody had done anything like this before. Okay? And so what I want to try to do is to explain how Whistler came to make this particular painting. Okay? And also to emphasize how it changed his life. Okay? So working toward it and then looking beyond it. This is really the midpoint in Whistler's artistic career. And so I think it can serve as an anchor to understand the man and the artist. Okay? Now, it all started here in Lowell, Massachusetts. That's the house Whistler was born in July of 1834. Now, he was always embarrassed by that fact. In fact, he denied he was born in Lowell. Lowell was a little factory town. The only reason he was born there is that his father, who was a world-renowned railroad engineer, had been hired to build a railroad from Lowell to Boston, and to build the locomotives also that would propel the railroad. And so I think because of this low-brow industrial town, Whistler simply didn't want to be associated with that. And in later years, as I say, he simply denied it. He said this: "I don't choose to be born in Lowell. I refuse to be born in Lowell. And I shall be born where I want to." He said. Well, that's typical Whistler. So where did he claim to be born? Well, Baltimore was one place, and he did live there for about a year. South Carolina, where he never went, never visited. Now, his mother was from North Carolina, and he was always proud of that Southern heritage. Okay? But North Carolina, South Carolina, North Carolina's kind of plebeian, kind of like Lowell. So he chose the more aristocratic South Carolina. He also claimed to be born here, St. Petersburg, Russia. Okay. He even claimed this in court under oath. Okay. Now, there's some truth to that. Okay? You have to bear in mind that Whistler was someone who created his own reality, both in his own life and, equally important, in his art. Okay? There's this Whistlerian world. Okay? And it is true that he had his first art lessons here as a boy. Okay? And so thinking in those terms, yes, he was born as an artist in St. Petersburg. That's what he looked like at the time. The reason he's there, the whole family upped and moved because the Russian government had hired his father to build a railroad between St. Petersburg and Moscow. So the family lives there from the time that Jimmy is about 9 until 14, okay? 5 years. This is, I think, around his 10th birthday. His brother Willie, 2 years younger than Jimmy. Quite a pair. Jimmy especially was a handful. We know that because his mother kept a diary in St. Petersburg, and she wrote this on his 10th birthday. "James is rather a trial to his mother's patience," she says, "but I hope will reward my perseverance when his character develops further. He is so eager in the pursuit of all that interests him." Now, other words that she used in that diary during those years to describe him were rambunctious, impetuous, animated, and strong-willed. And you could use those same words to describe him as an adult. Some of his drawings from those years, there's a marvelous little sketchbook that's been preserved. It's at the University of Glasgow to show his early work as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, 12-year-old. Napoleon, and this is apropos, because as a boy, Whistler wanted to be a soldier. I mentioned his father was an engineer. Well, his father was trained as an engineer at West Point. And so Jimmy grew up not only with his father, an Army officer before he retired, but also two uncles, one on his father's side, one on his mother's side. So he always assumed he would want also to go to West Point and be a great soldier. Back up. That's West Point. It wasn't until he was probably 13 or 14 Jimmy began to shed that youthful goal of being a soldier and said aloud to his parents for the first time that he wanted to be a painter. Now, this is done when he was in England. The last year that the family was in Russia, he was sent to London to live with his sister, who had married an Englishman. And so he was exposed to all the great art of London. He'd had, in addition to those art lessons in St. Petersburg, private lessons from his new brother-in-law, who was a fine etcher. And so one day late in early 1849, in an exchange of letters with his father, he and his father were writing back and forth. His father said it was time for him to think about a career, to think about a college to go to. And his father really wanted him to go to Harvard or Yale, not to West Point. And so in that exchange of letters, Jimmy says this to his father: "I hope, dear father, you will not object to my choice of a profession, namely a painter, for I wish to be one so very much, and I don't see why I should not. Many others have done so before. I hope you will say yes in your next, and that dear mother will not object to it." Well, just a few months after his father received that letter, his father died of cholera. And that changes everything for the entire family. They lose the prestige that they had had. I mean, they were essentially members of the Russian court, of the imperial court in St. Petersburg. Now they return to the United States. They settle in Connecticut. The income that his father had brought in, $10,000 a year from the Russian government, was gone. And really any hope of attending Harvard or Yale, you could forget about that. And so, in fact, Jimmy does go to West Point. This is a collage made about the time he was there. He was at West Point from 1851 to 1854. Okay. Let's see. Cadet barracks, where he lived. In fact, those are still there. The library, of course, the famous plane on which the cadets were drilled. Okay. And this was good insofar as additional art lessons. Part of the curriculum was devoted to drawing. That was an important skill for a 19th century Army officer. But Jimmy had skill far beyond that, and everyone recognized it at once. Someone who had had formal art training in Russia and England and now at West Point. And so at the end of his first year, he was asked to draw the cover illustration for the sheet music for that year's graduating class. And this is what he drew. You see here on the right a young cadet in cadet uniform, and on the left this recently graduated cadet, his former classmate in his new second lieutenant uniform. What's interesting is that in drawing this, Whistler made this second lieutenant a portrait of himself. That's a self-portrait. And what's really interesting is that he never wore that uniform. He flunked out of West Point at the end of his third year. Okay. Now, in later years, Whistler tried to explain this disappointment to his family, to his father's legacy. And he said that he had failed, he had been dismissed because he had failed his final exam in chemistry. Okay. Now, that's true. But Whistler said that the only reason he failed that exam is because he had misidentified the physical properties of silicon He had identified silicon as a gas. And so in later years, he would say, had silicon been a gas, I would have been a major general. Of course, the exam was much more difficult than that. And there was also a second reason that he never talked about, that he was dismissed. And that was because he had shattered all existing records for demerits at the Academy. Demerits being those little black marks you get for being late for formation, or having a dirty musket, or laughing in ranks. Each cadet was allowed 200 demerits per year. Okay? Whistler had well over 250 demerits at the end of that third year. And so he was asked to leave. Asked to leave, by the way, by the then superintendent of the Academy, who was Robert E. Lee. Well, what does a failed cadet do, a failed Army officer? One who really wants to be an artist. He goes to Paris. Okay? And that's where Whistler went 1 year after he had failed from West Point in 1855. And that year he turned 21. He received a small legacy from his father's will, from the family estate. And so he's off to Paris to be an artist. Now, there were other places to go, of course. Rome, Florence, Dusseldorf. Those are all centers of artistic training in the 19th century. But Paris was building a reputation as the place, a place of excitement. And this can be attributed to a large extent to a series of short stories written by Henri Murger, generally entitled Scenes of Bohemian Life. And Bohemian was the key word. Suddenly there was this romantic aura about Paris and living on your wits as a bohemian, as a young artist in a community of artists. None of you with much money, sharing that last bottle of wine, that last crust of bread, but devoting yourself to art, devoting yourself to the avant-garde, to challenging the establishment. That's what drew these young men there. And in that same company, in Whistler's generation, the same year, he was there for 4 years. During that same 4 years, other young French artists going to Paris included Monet, Degas, Manet, Fantin Latour, who was Whistler's closest friend, and young English artists as well. George du Maurier, who would later become the famous illustrator for Punch, was a good friend of Whistler. So was Edward Poynter, who would later become president of the Royal Academy. In fact, Whistler and du Maurier and Poynter and a few others formed what they call the English gang. They were the English-speaking members of this artistic community. Although it must be emphasized, Whistler, from the time he was a boy, spoke excellent French and could read and write French as well. In fact, many of his letters in later life, especially to his artist friends in France, are written in French. This is a self-portrait he made of himself shortly after arriving. The young bohemian. You see the beginning of a mustache there, which had been forbidden at West Point, no facial hair. And it echoes heroes of his. Rembrandt was one of his heroes. And you can see how that self-portrait is almost a duplicate of that one. Another youthful hero was Hogarth. And very soon, not when he went to Paris, but before he left, Velázquez as well. And those three, Rembrandt, Velázquez, Hogarth, also known as kind of edgy bohemians, rebels in their own right as well. But for a living hero, for a living model, no one could surpass Gustave Courbet. That was the artist that all these young men wanted to be like. Courbet was the head of a new school of art, a school of realism, which was the avant-garde school of the day, challenging classicism, challenging even romanticism. Okay? Of course, the whole idea of realism, as the name would imply, was to depict the world around you. Okay? You didn't paint pictures of biblical scenes or great historic events or great mountain ranges and landscapes. No, you painted the peasants, the farmers, the people in their villages, the people in the streets. That was the subject matter that Whistler embraced. And he did so in a series of etchings at first. He didn't make a lot of paintings at first. He was devoted to etching. And he became, I would say, the greatest etcher ever. Even in his day, the standard for etching was Rembrandt. And everyone in the 19th century conceded that Whistler, in many ways, had far exceeded Rembrandt in his skill as an etcher. This is a portrait of Mother Gerard, was her name. She was kind of a character in Paris at the time, in the neighborhood where Whistler lived, near the Luxembourg Gardens. She was a flower seller. She claimed to have a tapeworm, which required that she drink only milk in her diet. Also, in the suburbs outside of Paris, the Lone Tenement was one of Whistler's early works. And he had made enough of these by 1859 to actually collect them into a portfolio and sell them. And these were his first real sales as an artist, those etchings. But in 1859, he also decided that it was too hard to get on in Paris. There was too much competition. And there was a prejudice on the part of the French against British and American artists. And so he went to London. This is Piccadilly. Now, he had an advantage in going to London, because as I mentioned earlier, I think I did, he had a sister who lived there, his sister Deborah, who had married into an influential family, the Hayden family. Her husband was a physician and an amateur artist. And they had been encouraging Jimmy to come. Okay, they said, the prospects are far greater for you here. And you know, we'll look after you. You're low on funds. We'll make sure you get through the week. And so he decides to make London his home. Now, he's still doing the same art. Okay? It's still realism. Okay? Now, though, he goes down to the Thames, to the shadier, lower southern part of the Thames, where all the warehouses and the shipping and the longshoremen congregated. And he made a wonderful series of etchings here, as you see. This is a Billingsgate. Black Eagle Wharf is the name of this one. And this one is called the Thames Police. I emphasize this one, and I picked it especially to show to you, because Crystal Bridges now has a copy of this. Okay? Now, I say a copy, you understand, with an etching, you make many copies, several dozen perhaps, on a printing press. I'm not sure what state, that is how early a print Crystal Bridges has, but it certainly has this one. And let me do one other thing. I'd like to do more of this. I'll do it one time, I promise you, not make this part of the process. But you see this building here on the right. That's the Thames Police headquarters. What I like to do is to go to the places where Whistler made a picture, a painting, an etching, and see what it looks like today. This is that, and you see it's still a police station here. That's the same building. Okay? You see the dormers here, the bay windows. Let me go back. It's the same structure today. What was the ramp, or what were the stairs at the time? Now there's a ramp coming down to the river. Well, with Rembrandt as one of his great heroes, Whistler realized he couldn't be only an etcher. He had to commit himself to painting. And so his first exhibited painting came the year after, 1860, in London. And it was a great success. This is a young man who's never known failure. He's been raised in the lap of almost luxury, you would say, a famous father. And now everyone loves his work, his etchings, and now this painting is called At the Piano. It's a picture of his sister, that's Deborah on the left, and his niece, Annie, listening to her mother play. And it's painted in the Haydn's music room. That's their piano, that's their home. Okay? And he sold it immediately. Someone came up and said, I want that picture. He sold it for 30 pounds, which wasn't a lot of money. In American money at the time, that would have been about $150. Even in today's money, that's maybe $3,000 at the most. Although I'll tell you, my friends, if you see any Whistler for $3,000, grab it. Don't ask questions. And I can tell you a story about that later on. Because of that, he got his first commission. Okay? Someone wanted a picture of Battersea Bridge, which you see here. Only the same price, 30 pounds. But he's on his way. Still realism. He's fascinated by these bridges. This is another fine one. This is called The Last of Old Westminster. The old Westminster Bridge is over here. What you really see is the construction of the new Westminster Bridge that's being made there. This is 1863. And suddenly, Whistler is seized by panic. This is one of maybe 3 or 4 artistic crises in his life, where he feels that he's gone as far as he can with what he's been doing. Realism no longer has any appeal to him. And so for the next 6, 7 years, 1863 to 1870, he's struggling. I mean, he's continuing to produce work, but he's not happy. He knows it's not what he wants to create. It's not coming out right. But slowly during those years, a number of influences begin to work on him. Okay? And by the end of that period, he's going to have refashioned himself. He'll have left realism behind, and he'll embrace what can only be called a Whistlerian art. It's an art unique to him. And that's the way he wanted. He never wanted to be identified with any other school of art. In 1874, getting a bit ahead of the story, but in 1874, the Impressionists held their first exhibition as Impressionists. And of course, he knew all those fellows. And Degas came to him and said, exhibit with us, give us something, let us show, be part of our group. And he said, no. I'm my own man. I'm not going to be part of your dozen people. So what I want to explain is how he got to that point by the early 1870s. One of the influences came from Asia. Okay? Asian art had a tremendous influence on his entire generation. While he was at West Point, 1854, I think it was, trade officially opened up between the United States and Japan. Admiral Perry opens up trade. Now, of course, the art of Asia had been known before, but suddenly the Western markets, especially in Europe, are kind of glutted with Asian, especially Japanese screens, fans, kimonos, prints especially by Japanese artists, porcelain. And Whistler and all his friends became great collectors of these things. Manet and Degas were collecting porcelain and prints. Whistler in London, along with Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who was a good friend of Whistler by this time, the great pre-Raphaelite artist. They're all collecting these things. But Whistler does something the others do not do. Okay? He creates Asian art after a fashion. Painted this in 1864. Okay? And you see what he's trying to do. And this is typical Whistler. He's trying to cash in on the market. He sees people buying. There's this craze. It's called Japanisme. It was a craze for collecting all this Asian art. He said, okay, I'll create Asian art myself. Okay? And so you see this here in the dress and the manner. You also see a couple of Asian, typically Japanese artistic techniques, though, that he's also incorporating. One of those is this sharply stilted floor. That's clearly not natural. Okay? And also the flatness of it, the lack of depth. Okay? There's very little difference between that screen and the model standing there. That was typically Japanese. And Whistler makes it now part of his art by the time we get to the 1870s. It's also interesting, this model, her name was Christine Spartali, and she was part of Whistler's circle. And she was reputed to be the most beautiful young woman of her generation. She's about 18 years old here. And, and I'm reminded that Algernon Swinburne, the poet, who was part of Whistler's circle and Rossetti's circle, said that Christine was so beautiful. Whenever he saw her, he just had to sit down and cry. She was just the most gorgeous woman he had ever seen. This is Whistler's own gorgeous woman. The model here is Joanna Heffernan, his mistress and muse during these years, a young Irish lass. This is called the Golden Screen. And everything you see there belonged to Whistler. The prints, the screen, the kimono, that's part of his personal collection. And again, you see the flatness of it, the artificial slant of the floor. Whistler learned some other things from Asian art. And this might be the most important, the most revolutionary element of his new style of art. He looks at this as a former realist, remember. He says, well, that's not what a river looks like. That's not a mountain range. That's not the sort of bridge that we're accustomed to. Okay? And he suddenly realized that the Asians had a different perception of reality, and that he didn't have to have the same view, the same perception of reality that everyone else did. That he could create his own reality, something I said early on. And bear in mind, too, that this is the dawn of the age of photography. And Whistler began to say, okay, you want a perfect image? You want a realistic image? Hire a photographer. He'll do that for you. I'm an artist. I'm going to interpret. I'm going to improve on reality. I'm going to make it even more beautiful than you think it is. And he gets that from the Japanese. He also gets this, too. The Japanese are very big at simply implying that something was real or whole or was being presented as it was. So you see in this bridge here, for example, that artificiality, but I'm thinking especially here, this boat and the little man. Okay? It's just sort of a suggestion of a boat and a man. Whistler picks up on that too. Remember that painting of Battersea Bridge? His first commission. This is an etching of Battersea Bridge. But in 1871, Whistler made a painting, another painting of Battersea Bridge. There's that suggestion of the boat, the little man, essentially a Japanese bridge. I mean, Battersea Bridge does not look like that. Whistler made it look like that. Another influence on him closer at home was his good friend Albert Moore, an English painter who was part of the neoclassical tradition. And this is one of Moore's works. And what he learned from Moore was a new use of paint, okay? And in two ways. First of all, to get rid of sort of the garish colors that he had been taught to use by Courbet. Remember the brightness of the Christine Spartale. By the way, the name of that painting was The Princess from the Land of Porcelain, or The Golden Screen. Okay? And Whistler began to think that he had been seduced by color alone, and that there was more to art than just color. And so he learned from Albert Moore to limit his palette to no more than 3 colors, variations perhaps, and 2 would be best. And really they're just 2 colors here that Moore has used. You also see how he's been influenced by Japanisme as well. And the other thing he learns from Moore is to spread his paint as thinly as possible, barely cover the canvas. Now this too was the opposite of Courbet and the realist, who simply plastered the paint on there. They sometimes didn't even use brushes. They would use a palette knife to lay it on it to get almost a 3D effect. Okay? But now Whistler begins to paint like Moore. This is another Moore painting. I'll say Whistler for a moment here. Another influence. This is Valparaiso, Chile. Whistler was there for about a year in 1866. The reason's kind of complicated. He was essentially trying to make money by running arms, weapons, to the Chileans who were in a war against Spain. Okay. So he's there, but what's important are some things he learns about art and painting when he's there in Chile. You see the wharf here sticking out? I guess it was there when Whistler was there. He paints it. But you see what he's doing here? He's playing with the light. Different hemisphere. He begins to think about the effects of dawn and dusk on an artist and how that might be incorporated in a painting as well. And this might be the very best thing he did when he was at Valparaiso. Now he brought back, I mean, that doesn't look very shocking, does it, to you, or revolutionary, but he brought this painting back and showed it to some friends. Excuse me while I stumble along here. And this is called, by the way, crepuscle in flesh color and green, okay, the dominant colors. But his friend said this in looking at this painting for the first time. He says, "It is surprisingly novel, impossible to explain. It is a picture, excuse me, it is a picture that is very much an ensemble. But even so, excuse me, even so, one could cut it up into 3 or 4 or 5 pieces, and each piece would be a picture." I'm going to come back to that point. "It is something very difficult to understand and impossible to describe to someone who has not seen it. Whistler is asking a big question about pictures with their rules for treatment of light, receding lines, foregrounds, and backgrounds." Okay. Edgar Allen Poe, strangely enough, is an influence on Whistler. Of course, Poe is another one of those West Point black sheep who never graduated from the Academy. But in 1846, Poe wrote an essay, which Whistler read, entitled "The Philosophy of Composition." Okay. And what Poe was trying to do in that essay was explain some of the tricks he used in his short stories, and especially in his poetry. And one of the tricks he used was repetition. And he used the poem "The Raven" as an example. Quote the raven, "nevermore, nevermore." And Poe explained that he used that to connect the stanzas of a long poem, to keep maintain the reader's attention, keep to the story at hand. Well, this reminded Whistler that the Japanese did something like that also with color. Not using a word or phrase, but using the same color repeatedly here and there to embroider a picture. And he wrote this to his friend Fantin Latour when this revelation came to him. This is a letter in 1867, and he writes this to Fantin. He says, "Don't you see?" He's excited. He says, "Don't you see the same color reappearing continually here and there, like the same thread, the whole forming in this way a harmonious pattern?" So he's thinking about patterns in his art. He begins now for the first time to talk about the science of painting, the laws of painting. Not just splashing color on a canvas, okay, but having a plan, having little tricks that you're going to use to create your own school of art. A couple of other things, finally, to wrap this up. Not doing with technique, but with Whistler's thinking, his philosophy of painting. It's about this time, maybe even earlier, probably by 1863, 64. Whistler begins to think, indeed to become convinced, that a painter should not be obliged in a painting to tell a story, which is what most painters forever had done. Okay? A painting usually is a picture of something or someone, a particular place, a particular person, a biblical scene, a historic event. People looked at paintings and expected that painting to be the same as a book or an essay, to tell them something. And Whistler said that's not the purpose of art. The only purpose of art is to make something beautiful that will grab the eye, grab the attention. As he becomes an early convert to what will become the aesthetic movement by the 1870s and 1880s. Oscar Wilde will be its big star. But the catchphrase of aestheticism was art for art's sake. We create art only for the sake of creating art. There's no moral statement here. There's no ethical statement we're trying to make. We're not trying to duplicate history. We're trying to create something beautiful. And Whistler is completely won over by that approach. So much so, finally, the other part of this, he begins to title his paintings, just the paintings, not usually the etchings, with musical terms. He begins to call his paintings symphonies, nocturnes, arrangements, harmonies, usually with the dominant color. Okay? So a symphony in white, a nocturne in black and gold. And his reason for doing that is to tell his audience, look, when you go to a concert and you hear a symphony, you're not looking for a story. Okay? You're simply accepting the beauty of the entire piece. Yes, it might be divided into movements, but you don't think of it in that way. You embrace the entirety of it. Just like my painting, you can divide it into 2 or 3 pieces, but it's still an ensemble. And this now becomes his goal, to create paintings that look like that. And with all these other elements I mentioned. The thinness of the paint, the limited palette. And one of the first paintings he does to his satisfaction, in which he incorporates all of those elements, is that one. And you knew I had to show it somewhere along the line. Okay? But it's called an arrangement in gray and black. Okay? The subtitle is A Portrait of the Artist's Mother, but that's not important. And indeed, Whistler made a statement about that that kind of sums up many of these things I've been trying to say. It's hard to see that it's not really dark enough here, but you see the embroidery in the curtain, and how that matches her handkerchief and her headband there. Simply gray and black. Asked about this painting, Whistler said this: art should be independent of all claptrap. It should stand alone and appeal to the artistic sense of eye or ear without confounding this with emotions entirely foreign to it, such as devotion, pity, love, patriotism, and the like. Take the picture of my mother, exhibited at the Royal Academy as an arrangement in gray and black. Now that is what it is. To me, it is interesting as a picture of my mother, but what can or ought the public to care about the identity of the portrait? And that is indeed how he came to paint his famous Nocturnes as well. Beginning 1871-72 were the earliest and probably the best of them. Okay? Limited palette. Looks like only one color there in some ways. Thinness of the paint. Even a little tribute always to the Asians. Another one. There's, again, just the suggestion of a man, a fisherman standing by the seaside. And that is how you get this. Now, this is more revolutionary, clearly, than any of those others. It does depict an actual event. It's a fireworks display at Cremorne Gardens, kind of an amusement park, only about a quarter of a mile down the river from where Whistler lived. But no one understood it. No one understood the portrait of his mother. You should read some of the reviews of that. The work of an eccentric, they said. Okay. But this one especially caused trouble because it was reviewed by John Ruskin. Now, John Ruskin was the preeminent art critic, art authority, if you will, of his day. And if he didn't like your work, it wasn't going to sell. And he wrote this about the Nocturne in black and gold. I have seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. That could have been the end of Whistler's career. Okay? And indeed, after that review appeared in 1877, he never painted another nocturne. Now, he would draw, he would etch nocturnes, but never those grand canvases he had done before. But I mentioned this painting was both the culmination and the beginning of a stage in Whistler's life. So we really have to tie up that review by Ruskin with another event, which I'll do very quickly here. Whistler was already having trouble with his then principal patron, Frederick Leyland, whom you see here, in a portrait called An Arrangement in Black. That's a portrait of Leyland's wife, which I think is Whistler's very best portrait. Okay. Well, about the time he was completing the Nocturne in Black and Gold, Leyland wanted Whistler to redecorate the dining room of a house he had just bought, 49 Princess Gate, which you see here in London. It's on the Exhibition Road, if you know that. The dining room is here on the side. Those are the windows. And for that room, Whistler created the famous Peacock Room, okay, which is now installed in the Freer Gallery in Washington. Those are the shutters covering the windows to the outside. That's perhaps a little clearer picture of it. And when he was finished, Whistler said he wanted 2,000 guineas for his work. Well, Leyland was outraged. First of all, he had been away when all this was being done, and he was flabbergasted by the difference between what he thought Whistler was going to be doing and what he actually did. And so he refused to pay the 2,000 guineas. He paid 1,000 guineas. So then when this review by Ruskin comes out, Whistler decides that he'll sue Ruskin to get that 1,000 guineas that Leyland owes him. Okay? And the result is a celebrated court case in London in 1878, in which Whistler sues Ruskin for libel. Well, he wins the case. This is a cartoon from Punch to illustrate it. He wins the case, but because it was up to the judge to decide the damages, how much damage had been done to Whistler's reputation as a result of that review. The judge decided that Whistler should be awarded only 1 farthing in damages, which is less than a penny. And so you have this giant, this giant farthing, which he has there. Now, result of that, very rapidly, Whistler goes bankrupt. Okay. His career is almost ended, or he thinks it is. He has to auction off his house, all of his porcelain, all of his belongings, all of his art. And he's lucky to get a commission to go to Venice to make some works there. Okay? And so he lives in Venice, 1879 through 1880. And he rediscovers himself again. He begins to create a different kind of art, a different kind of etching. This is the same man who made the Eagle Wharf, Billingsgate. He's now, again, the idea of creating your own impression, your own reality. He does the same thing with his etchings. Now, he calls this etching a nocturne, okay? But this is his new style of nocturne, not the giant painted ones. In all of these works, I should say, he begins to think that he does his best work on a very small scale, 8 by 10, 5 by 9, be it a painting, an etching, a lithograph. Now, he will later on make larger paintings, especially portraits. But his very best work now is on a much smaller scale after 1880. Pastels, he revolutionizes the idea of how a pastel should be made when he's in Venice. He comes back to London, he does the same thing, storefronts in Chelsea, small oil. And this is what I'm getting to, because we're at Crystal Bridges. He also even makes little seascapes in that way, such as the one hanging across the way. Another idea for a nocturne, this is a lithograph. This also is owned by Crystal Bridges. It's called Early Morning, 1878. It's a very early lithograph. Whistler only begins to create lithographs in the late 1870s. So this is now part of the collection. As is this. This is a painting. It's in color. I couldn't get a colored picture. It's called The Chelsea Girl, done in 1884. It's very unfinished. Okay? But what you have now, being collected finally by Crystal Bridges in the way of Whistler, are some very typical works, typical of different eras of his life. You have the 1859 Thames etching. You have the 1884 Chelsea Girl, the 1870 lithograph. And in 1896 is the little seascape. Now, if you want to know more about Whistler, go to London if you have a chance. There's a statue of him there at the foot of Battersea Bridge on the Thames, looking out on the river he had painted or drawn so many, many, many times in his life.